So, now that Game of Thrones is over, I decided to make a review about the final season, which in my opinion was the worst season in Game of Thrones. I wanted to do a full in-depth review of it, but decided that it would be too time consuming, so this video is just gonna focus on the episodes 3 to 6. And yes, I'm just gonna ignore the first 2 episodes, because there wasn't really much to criticize, since there wasn't really much happening in them. So I decided to cut them off and get to the part of the season where things actually happen, which is episodes 3 to 6. Have fun. Let's get the first thing out of the way before this review starts. Yes, this episode was too dark. And it was the first time in Game of Thrones where I had to adjust the brightness and turn off all the light sources, so I can actually see what's happening on screen. It's an artistic choice I don't really like, but it didn't really bother me, so moving on. I said before that this is the worst season of Game of Thrones. And this episode is in my opinion the worst one in this season. There are a lot of things wrong with it, but before we talk about the bad things, what were the good things about this episode? There's some beautiful shots. The scene where the Night King smirks was pretty cool. Lyanna killing an undead giant was pretty cool too. So was the Hound's inner fight with himself. Theon got a good and deserving ending for his character. And lastly, Ramin Djawadi. He did an incredible job with the soundtrack, and it was probably the best thing about this episode. Now that the good things are out of the way, let's talk about the bad things. This episode already starts off with some questionable battle tactics, and I just want to get everyone on the same page here, right? This battle is probably the most important one for humanity. You would think that for a battle this important, they would have got Evan Rommel himself on set for this episode, but instead they start off the battle with the Dothraki suicide charging into the enemy. Into enemies they can't even see, nor can even kill properly with their own weapons. Not an ideal way to start off a battle against enemies who can just revive the dead and turn them into mindless wights. And it's not even like they didn't know that. Jon has seen it himself happening before. Okay, you know what? All of this, no problem. I know why D&D made the scene, and it's so we can see the light of the Dothraki extinguish, which I have already mentioned was a pretty cool shot. And it's not like the show hasn't been illogical before numerous times. And I was ready to forgive it, so I will also forgive this one. After that we see Dany and Jon decide to help out, and Jon gets caught into a blizzard the White Walkers have just created because he was charging too far forward into White Walker territory. He can't really see much and gets attacked by Viserion and the Night King. And then Dany joins in and we see 3 dragons fighting. And here's something I don't understand. Why didn't the Night King just put spears into Jon's dragon and later into Dany's dragon, instead of fighting them head on? Or even better, why not cast the whole blizzard over Winterfell, let the Whites do all the work, and then take out the dragons? There are so many ways how he could have taken out all of Winterfell without much problems. But the show keeps telling us that this is supposed to be a fight on eye level. And also, Jon doesn't face any consequences whatsoever for doing stupid stuff, because it seems that everybody in this show is incompetent, including the Night King. But I guess asking for actual battle tactics is too much. And you know very well why D&D did the dragon fighting scene. Just like the Dothraki scenes, they wanted to show off and look how cool this is, even though it's nonsensical and stupid. I would have never thought I say this about Game of Thrones, but all of this is just style over substance. And fan service is fine and everything, but just don't lose your authenticity along the way. Meanwhile, the Unsullied and the main characters, and Sam, are all fighting the Whites, and somehow all of the main characters survive. I can't tell you how many times I thought a character died just to find out they survived somehow. Just on top of my head, There were like 6 instances where I thought, surely he or she will die now, just to see them get away relatively unharmed. Also, what was Bran doing all the time? What was his plan the whole fight? He was just sitting there and controlling ravens? I guess he wanted to know the Night King's position and everything, but this is one of the instances where this information is of no use. Who are you going to tell where the Night King is? Dany? Jon? Or Arya? Bran's abilities are still relatively unknown, so why not do something cool and actually useful, like taking over a white or something? Surely there were better plans with Bran. This is not the first time and it won't be the last time where we will ask ourselves, why is Bran not doing anything useful? In the meantime, we see Arya fighting a lot of whites on her own, and she succeeds until she is kinda overwhelmed with it. Then she flees in the library where she just barely escapes, and only after Beric sacrifices himself. Things get now a little bit more desperate for Winterfell. Jon is facing off against Viserion and decides to scream at him. I mean, I guess there isn't really much. People tend to do irrational things in hopeless situations anyway. But I would have preferred him to T-pose at the dragon to assert further dominance. But the scream is fine too, I guess. Now that everything seems lost, it's Theon against the Night King, in a last attempt to stop him. He fails, but at least he stood his man, and that's all you can really ask for. Now, people, comes the biggest problem with this episode. All the problems I had with this episode are lightweights compared to what is about to come. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the payoff we get after 8 whole seasons of build-up, after almost all we have gone through. D&D decides to do this with the Night King storyline. I think this is the point where even the most casual viewers have to admit that the bad writing of this show, which has been going on in the last season and this season, just became more apparent than ever. This is the same show that carefully constructed the Red Wedding, Ned Stark's death, and Oberyn Martell's death. What made the Red Wedding, for example, so effective, and what made this scene a pile of crap, is what the writers of the specific scenes had in mind when they talk about subverting expectations. George R.R. Martin made scenes like the Red Wedding to avoid cliché fantasy storytelling. After Ned Stark's death, you as a viewer probably expected a revenge for his death. And who is better suited for this than Ned's oldest son Robb and Ned's wife Catelyn Tully, or Catelyn Stark. This scene was supposed to be a victory for the good guys. They finally get more men to fight against the bad guys, but it turns out the enemy was here before you. And this whole thing turns out to be the worst thing that happened in Game of Thrones up till this point. There was even foreshadowing going on just moments before their death. With this scene, I don't know what D&D had in mind when they were doing this scene. They probably thought, since this is unexpected, just like the Red Wedding, this must be as good as the Red Wedding. Well, they kinda completely ignored the part with avoiding cliché fantasy writing and just did the most cliché thing you can do. The good guy comes on top in the last seconds and saves the day. And best of all, everybody died, it seems, with the exception of the main characters. Remember when the first episode of Game of Thrones released? In the very beginning of the show, we see the deserter of the Night Watch go beyond the wall. One of them sees strange ritual-like murders. He runs back to his men, and they just assume it's some wild link's voodoo. Only later to find out the hard way that this is not what they thought it would be. The one deserter survives. He tells Ned Stark what he saw, but he just gets executed, because at the time nobody believed him. The White Walkers were believed to be a myth, nothing more. Let's recreate the scene, but now somebody from, let's say, House Tully goes beyond the wall with his men and faces the same thing. What do you think will be the outcome of this? If you guessed he will be executed, then you are 100% right. And that is a problem. After 8 seasons of build-up, White Walkers will still be a myth for the rest of Winterfell, with the exception of the few people who survived the battle, which at the end made the conclusion of the White Walkers and the Night King so much more unsatisfying. You get the feeling it was all worthless at the end anyway, and it, more importantly, killed a lot of the rewatchability of Game of Thrones. This battle of Winterfell was never meant to be a winning battle for humanity anyway. This should have been a matter of how long can we keep the White Walkers away from Westeros without losing everybody in the process. It would have been so much more satisfying to have the Night King as the end boss of the show, which would have been a much more fitting end if you ask me. If I would have to give this episode a rating, I would honestly give it a 2 out of 10. Yes, it had a lot of good things, but the bad things, and especially the ending of this episode, just heavily outweighed all the good things in this episode. And there's just not much more for me to say about this episode. It was very frustrating to watch. And now let's get to episode 4. As of time of recording, this is the worst rated Game of Thrones episode so far. And yeah, this episode was a total shit show. I still think The Long Night was worse, but my incredible low expectation didn't make this episode any better. The first 25 minutes of this episode is some of the worst I have seen in Game of Thrones. And mind you, this is after we saw the disappointment that was episode 3. And all we see is characters just telling dumb jokes, drinking and having sex. And this is all we see in a third of this episode. The only thing that is maybe worth commenting is that Brienne was a virgin and lost her virginity to Jaime. I thought it was weird bringing up that Brienne is a virgin, and I didn't really like her and Jaime as lovers. I always thought that their relationship was more of platonic nature, but if that's what D&D have in mind, then fine, go ahead. Well, it turns out that this is actually not what the writers had in mind with Jaime. So he breaks Brienne's heart and rides back to King's Landing. Honestly, up until this point, this entire episode feels like some teenage melodrama. But luckily, after a while, something finally happens. Dany, Jon, Tyrion and Varys, all of them plan to bring down Cersei. And Dany really wants to get the throne as quickly as possible. She could wait for so long. She was in a completely different continent for 6 seasons. But now she can't wait any longer and wants the throne as soon as possible. Yes, makes sense. After a tough and exhausting battle, let's already plan the next one. Could this be maybe because D&D want to wrap up Game of Thrones in just 2 more episodes? We then see Jon confronted by Arya and Sansa. Sansa and Arya still don't trust Dany. They never give an exact reason why they mistrust Dany, and seem to ignore that Dany has risked so much and lost as much. And I can't exactly put my finger on it, but it seems to me that the dialogue is getting worse and worse. The dialogue was always one of the strongest aspects about Game of Thrones, but now every dialogue feels so robotic that it gives me serious The Walking Dead flashbacks. And right before Bran is revealing who Jon really is, this scene just cuts off. I was already criticizing the dialogue, and this was your chance to prove me wrong, D&D. This would have been a very interesting scene, and the only reason I can think of why they may have cut it out is that they didn't want to make the episode too long. But you guys just wasted almost 30 minutes of this episode with characters drinking and doing dumb jokes. If you can't get that into an episode, then surely you can also get a little bit more dialogue in. Especially because the very next scene is Bronn confronting Tyrion and Jaime, which is one of the dumbest scenes ever, and I have no idea why it's even in here or why Bronn is even alive. Earlier this season, Cersei sent Bronn to Winterfell to kill Tyrion. I don't know why exactly Bronn, since he's one of the biggest mercenaries in the whole show, and Bronn knows Tyrion and Jaime very well. He probably knows he can get something better from them than from Cersei. And so they do. Jaime promises that once the war is over, Bronn can keep Highgarden, which Bronn of course believes, and just like that, he leaves Winterfell just as easy as he got into Winterfell. Sansa breaks the promise he gave Jon and tells Tyrion that Jon is the rightful heir of the throne. And Tyrion gives this information to Varys immediately after. And yeah, you see, this is gonna be a problem later on. And Varys already thinks about betraying Dany right after he got that information. Just like Sansa, up until this point there is no real reason for them to betray her. It seems that D&D want us to believe so desperately that Dany is a bad guy. Dany and her fleet now reach Dragonstone and get a warm and welcoming surprise. It turns out that
Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and
she just forgot about the Iron Fleet, who have done her so much trouble in the past. Ah yes, that happens. This is the absolute state of writing in Game of Thrones. She lost a dragon, a good bunch of her troops, ships, and they capture Missandei. All of this in 5 minutes. 5 minutes and Euron has done more damage to Dany than the Night King has done in the entire long night. Yes, let's disrespect our boy in blue even more after that last episode, as if that wasn't enough. The Night King died for this. He's not even an afterthought in this episode. This is almost insulting, and so far this entire episode has been nothing but inconsistency in writing, bad dialogue, and ridiculousness. And it shows you again that magic doesn't seem to be a thing anymore in Game of Thrones. The Night King and the White Walkers are dead. Missandei is dead. No Faceless Man. We have seen nothing of Essos in the last 2 seasons. And now they killed 2 out of 3 dragons. And it seems like they made the remaining dragon useless. Even Qyburn, who resurrected the mountain and made him into a zombie, never came up with the idea to make more of them. I just want something in this season that sparked the same joy when I first got to know more about the Children of the Forest, or the introduction to the Night King, or remember when Missandei gave birth to that weird shadow-like figure that killed Renly Baratheon? This was one of the most disturbing things in Game of Thrones. We still haven't seen anything like that this or last season. And this is not the only thing they have abandoned during the course of this last season. Nothing new happening in Essos. What's with Yara Greyjoy? What's with Robin Arryn? Nothing new from Dorne after they absolutely butchered Doran's story arc. Ilyn Payne. Yeah, who still remembers Ilyn Payne? I bet that's a name most haven't heard of in a while. In the last scene of this episode, we see Tyrion trying to negotiate with Qyburn, but Tyrion realizes that this is going nowhere, so he tries to negotiate with Cersei as a last try to maybe end this peacefully. And of course Cersei declines, and the mountain executes Missandei in front of Dany and Grey Worm. Nobody really knows why Cersei just didn't kill all of them right there. They were all perfectly in line of sight. A few shots with the Scorpion will have done it. I mean, she could have at least killed Tyrion. She sent Bronn to Winterfell and was ready to pay him for the death of Tyrion. And now Tyrion is in front of her and she doesn't do it. Another example of inconsistency in the writing, and it's a fitting way to end this episode. I haven't even mentioned anything positive in this episode, and I honestly don't know if there was anything positive in this episode. Maybe I have to analyze this episode to find something that I like, but if that's the only way for me to find something good about this episode, then that's a big problem. I was feeling dead inside watching this episode. I was still in shock about the long night, and how effortlessly they killed this show. Final rating for this episode? 3 or 4 out of 10. But probably more 3. Not as bad as The Long Night, but close. I'm just gonna go right ahead and say that this is the best episode of this season. Not that there was tough competition, but I still wanted to mention that it's far from perfect, and we still see D&D's signature all over this episode, and similar to The Long Night, it had great directing, acting, sound editing, and cinematography. But also similar to The Long Night, there was once again something that really bothered me, even though it wasn't anywhere near as bad as The Long Night, but we'll talk about that later. So don't get your hopes too high up, because there's still a lot to talk about. In the beginning, we see Varys writing letters which he'll probably send all over Westeros, so everybody knows who the rightful heir of the throne is. Then a little girl comes in and basically tells him she didn't succeed in poisoning Dany, and Varys just tells her to try another time. I didn't even pick this up the first time watching, and I really don't know why Varys is all of a sudden so keen to betray the next ruler he serves. Sure, they have some differences, but I would have understand his behavior maybe at the end of this episode, but not now. Then Tyrion snitches on Varys snitching, and so Varys gets executed by fire. This won't be the last person we will see dying by dragonfire in this episode. Varys has been acting very strange this last few episodes, and he was basically telling Jon earlier this episode if he wants to commit treason with him, which is very out of character for somebody this cautious. He always seemed to be one step ahead, and I really don't know what happened with him. He's one of the characters just like Bran, the Night King, Jon, Jaime and Tyrion, where I get the feeling that D&D had no clue what to do with him, and it shows. This whole season seems all to be about Dany and maybe Arya. So yeah, I really didn't like how they handled Varys. Tyrion then tells Dany that when the bells are ringing in King's Landing, she should retreat her troops so that nobody innocent gets hurt. Then Tyrion and Jaime have a conversation, where Tyrion tells Jaime that he has to ring the bells once he's in King's Landing. Jaime agrees. They then have an emotional moment together.
If it weren't for you, I never would have survived my childhood. You would have. You were the only one who didn't treat me like a monster. You were all I had.
And I also like that this is the last scene that we see just right before the storm that is about to come. After episode 4, I ask myself how on earth Dany is going to take over King's Landing, now that the Scorpions are such a huge threat, and also trying to keep the number of civilian casualties as low as possible. I even thought that maybe Dany's not even gonna use her dragons. She only has one left, so she really gotta be cautious. It's not unreasonable at all to change tactics after she lost a dragon and barely survived last time. It would only be logical, but Game of Thrones is long not about logic and things making sense anymore. And after I saw that preview, where we see Euron and his ships with the scorpions, and Euron's looking up in the sky at what is presumably Dany and her dragon, and here I thought, okay, so she is still gonna use her dragons. I mean, it's a battle, it's probably her last battle, so despite what I said earlier, it makes sense to bring dragons into a battle, of course. But now there gotta be a little twist. Why else did they not show the dragon? I personally thought that it has probably some armor or at least chainmail, something to keep the scorpions in check. And then the episode aired and it turns out, nope. She just charged in with her dragon super fast and destroys the Iron Fleet in a matter of seconds. And nobody hits her.
I did not hit her. It's not true. It's bullshit. I did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
I just don't understand how Euron was able to put 3 shots into a dragon in a matter of seconds, but then once the dragon is right in front of them, they can't hit anything. And this is not the first time. This happened also last time, in the last episode. Okay, I mean, it did seem to me that they were surprised by the attack, and that was further proven by the fact that the scorpions weren't even facing her to begin with. The scorpions were facing in another direction, so they didn't anticipate her. This still feels too easy to me, and once the entirety of the Iron Fleet was destroyed, I knew that this is gonna be a massacre. The Golden Company and the Lannisters are facing off against the Unsullied, Jon's men, and somehow also the Dothrakis, even though everyone thought they died, but that's okay, I guess. They kinda forgot they died against the Army of the Dead. This little stare-down contest is interrupted by Dany, and she kills all of the Golden Company, the Scorpions, and a huge chunk of the Lannisters. By the way, what happened with the Scorpions? They were so strong last time, and now? I don't know if the blame is on the Scorpions or the Scorpion marksmen, or if the Scorpions were nerfed somehow. Again, the inconsistency in writing is becoming very apparent again. Then the Lannisters put down their swords, and this is the moment where the battle is over. But I thought, maybe Cersei has still an ace up her sleeve. Turns out she didn't. We hear the bells ringing, which is King's Landing's way of saying, we surrender. This battle is over, and Dany is still angry. And so, what does she do? She unleashes hell upon all the children, women and men of King's Landing. Innocent civilians. Dany murders millions of innocent civilians. A character that is known as the Breaker of Chains because she freed the slaves. A character that chained up her own dragons because of the loss of one innocent life. This same character, just out of nowhere, murders a city home to millions. It's like one of these shock scenes in some average horror movie. The movie knows it doesn't have much to offer, so they just put one shock scene in there that comes out of nowhere, so you at least have something to remember from the movie. Game of Thrones writing is officially now on the same level as an average horror movie, ladies and gentlemen. A movie or a show has to earn this type of shocking moments, and when you do them out of nowhere, it just feels like you're trying to be shocking for the sake of it. And now that Dany kills an entire city with her dragon, the Unsullied, Northern men, and the Dothraki help her out and murder the children and women who hide in their homes. Jon doesn't want any of this and tells his men to retreat, but he knows he can't do much, so he at least tries to save as many innocent lives as possible. Tyrion is completely shocked by these events, and this is probably his realization that Varys and Sansa have been right all along. I don't think Varys and Sansa knew that Dany would murder millions of civilians. I personally always interpreted it as them just trying to gain something by betraying Dany for their own personal interest. Now we are supposed to believe that Sansa and Varys' shitty behavior is now justified. Because of something nobody saw coming? Okay, maybe I do understand Sansa not trusting Dany. She has been through a lot of shit and has seen her fair share of psychopaths. So maybe she did knew something was up. And Varys is also pretty intelligent, so he probably also sensed something very wrong with Dany. Maybe. So I guess there is probably an argument to be made that their concerns were maybe justified back then. But we as viewers, or most of us, thought that there was definitely a step missing for her to be the Mad Queen. Yeah, maybe Sansa and Varys knew it, but we didn't. I mean, even Emilia Clarke didn't know that this would be Dany's fate. You'd think they would at least tell her that. Emilia herself didn't see the twist coming. Wouldn't it make more sense to tell her right from the get-go what they are trying to build, so she can at least also somehow incorporate that in her acting, to maybe convey it better to us as viewers? That's just not how you build that up. You can't just make her the Mad Queen in just 2 episodes. We as viewers should naturally see her growing more and more into a monster. Breaking Bad, which is the best TV show ever, did that perfectly. But 2 characters mistrusting Dany? This doesn't give anyone the idea that she's gonna burn down an entire city. And don't tell me her losing Missandei, a dragon or Jorah or whatever are the reason. Just because of loved one dying in a war, she forgets about her own philosophy and what she stands for? I just don't buy that. Meanwhile, Jaime takes a little detour because he couldn't get into the city, and then right before he gets to the Red Keep, he meets Euron, and they fight, and Jaime wins somehow. This whole scene was pretty uninteresting, and the main fight we all want is about to come, so let's just skip this. Also, Euron has been nothing than a meme this season. I liked him in season 7 when he killed those sand snakes, and I think we all were thankful to him for doing that. But I think his time has just come. He has just been completely uninteresting in this entire season. He has just been a clown pirate. Arya and the Hound are now at the Red Keep. The Hound sends Arya back because he doesn't want her to die or end up like him. And Arya calls him Sander for the first time, I think, before she leaves. On the one hand, I do like the chemistry between the Hound and Arya. They compensate very well together, and that we can see how much the Hound cares for Arya. But on the other hand, this again feels like that the writers didn't know what to do with a character in a situation, so now she has to leave after all the way, and she is so close to killing Cersei, a person that is on her list, and now she just gets sent away like that? Well, whatever, at this point let's just accept it. D&D have given up. Let's go to the next scene. The Mountain, Qyburn and Cersei are fleeing Red Keep, and huge rocks are raining down on them. The Mountain shields Cersei so she doesn't get hurt, and this really shows you how loyal he is. And then the Hound shows up and challenges the Mountain to a fight.
Sir Gregor, I command you. Obey your queen, Sir Gregor.
And just like that, all the loyalty flies out of the window. The Mountain is like, screw it, we know you want Clegane Bowl, so here it is. Cersei then leaves the scene so we can enjoy Clegane Bowl, and I honestly think that this was the best thing that happened since the Battle of the Bastards. I know some people didn't like it, but I was hooked from the beginning. The Hound realizes that his brother, who now looks like Shrek, is undiable. Is that even a word? Whatever. He's unkillable with weapons, so he plunges into his own death and takes his brother with him. A poetic death, and a very fitting one if you ask me. Can I also say what a great character the Hound is, and I'm just glad that D&D didn't screw up his storyline and gave him a deserving ending. The Hound was one of the characters who was there from the beginning, and him and Tywin are 2 characters which you could publish and fill a book about their greatest quotes, and I will totally buy it. Even while he's fighting his brother, a simple sentence like
Fucking God!
are just so memorable and hilarious because of the tone in which he says it. He's definitely one of the most and best fleshed out characters, and it's also very Game of Thrones like, that he, somebody who isn't a special chosen one, who is on a special mission, somebody like him who is just happy as long as he has some camaraderie and some good wine, ends up getting one of the most fulfilling conclusions to his story arc in this show. So you've done well with this one, D&D. One small detail I also really liked was that we could saw the wildfire blowing up all over the city. This wildfire was hidden under the city by the Mad King, and it's nice that D&D didn't kinda forgot about this one. Jaime and Cersei tried to escape through the route Tyrion told Jaime about earlier this episode, but the way is barricaded by falling rock that Dany's dragon has created. They realize they can't go anywhere, so they die together, killed by the city falling down on them. I almost kinda teared up a little bit in this scene, and I thought that this was a very fitting end for Cersei and Jaime, and I'm sure George R.R. Martin probably has something similar in mind for Cersei and Jaime's death in the books. The rest of the episode is Arya trying to escape the hellhole that is King's Landing, and she somehow survives all of this, even though everybody else died. I mean, if the Long Night and now also this can't destroy your plot armor, I'm not sure what will. It's also pretty crazy that the Grey Worm is somehow still alive. I mean, he was always at the front line, and he even outlived Cersei and Jaime. I personally feel him, Davos, Bran, Brienne, and also maybe Jon should have all died in the Long Night. Them being alive gives me further the impression that being on the front line in the Long Night seemed to be the safest place to be in Westeros, even though it was supposed to be the battle to take down humanity. But let's just forget about the Long Night. But I can't forget the fact that how useless Jon and Bran, for example, have been. This season, they have done absolutely nothing that justified them still being alive at this point, and it becomes more and more clear that D&D still don't know what to do with them. But maybe I'm wrong. There is still one more episode to go. I almost forget to mention one thing. A lot of people have been asking themselves what this horse is supposed to mean and why it's still alive with Arya. I personally thought that this was the horse we saw earlier, one of the horses from the Golden Company, which got blown away by the impact of Drogo's fire, but I could be wrong. Either way, I didn't really care too much about this small detail. It's already established that Arya has crazy plot armor. So all in all, my two main issues with this episode was the out of nowhere transformation from Dany into the Mad Queen, and that D&D still don't know what to do with a good portion of their main characters. Other than this very big problems, I thought it was a decent episode. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. This is now the worst rated Game of Thrones episode on IMDb, and it's a real shame that the last episode is the worst rated one. I'm going to try to keep this short. I know it's the last episode of Game of Thrones, so you will think this is the episode I will go on the longest about, but we already talked about the biggest problems of this season, and this episode, be it the last one, has the same fundamental problems like the other episodes before. And I'm starting to think that I sound like a broken record. But if the episode keeps repeating the same problems over and over again, then I will have to criticize them again. These problems are now deeply rooted and it's impossible to solve them in one episode. So you guys leave me no other choice than to criticize them. There are still positive things in here and we are gonna talk about them. Actually, the beginning starts off pretty strong. Tyrion is walking down a completely destroyed King's Landing. Him finding his brother dead was a strong scene to me. And there are some more good things we are gonna get to later. But remember the horse last episode? No? Yeah, me neither. And it seems like Arya forgot about the horse too. Wasn't she riding the horse last episode? Where is it gone? And also, it seems like the Dothrakis and the Unsullied are spawning with each battle. Everybody is jerking off over this scene, but am I the only one who didn't like it? I thought it was corny as hell. Imagine how cool it would have been if every story arc in this show had a satisfying conclusion at the end of the season, and we will be talking about that. But instead, the best thing about this episode was this shot. Cool, I guess. The next scene is pretty cool again, admittingly. Tyrion is standing up against Dany and throwing away his emblem. He's going to prison anyway, so why not? Generally, I think the first 20 minutes are pretty strong. This feeling of unease and dread is portrayed pretty spot on. It still has dumb dialogue.
You'll always be a threat to her. And I know a killer when I see one.
Yeah, it takes a real genius to see that one. Thanks, Captain Obvious. But other than that, this episode starts off pretty decent before it slowly gets shittier and shittier. I still like dialogue between Jon and Tyrion's cell. It's not masterclass writing, but it's interesting nonetheless. Jon still gives his classic NPC dialogue options like "She's my queen" or "I don't want it," but it was very clear to me that Jon lost almost all faith in Dany. After Jon talks to Dany, who's eyeing the Iron Throne, he now loses all of the little bit faith he had in Dany. And now finally, even he realizes she's a crazy bitch, and so he stabs her. Drogon flies over and sees Dany dead. Hearing Drogo slowly coming towards you as you just murdered his mom, it must be pretty unsettling. And they did a great job again, showing us how terrifying a dragon can be. They already done that pretty effortlessly in the last episode, but they pulled it off brilliantly again. So Drogo is now mad because Dany is dead, and so he burns the Iron Throne, instead of Jon. See, we don't quite know how intelligent dragons are, so who knows what was going on in his mind. Somebody on Reddit posted that Drogon is either the smartest dragon ever, because he understood what the Iron Throne stood for, and it was ultimately the downfall of Dany, or he's quite possibly just very dumb, because he saw the knife in Dany and assumed that the throne, which is made of 1,000 swords and knives, stabbed her. Drogon then flies away with Dany, and it's not revealed where exactly, and we don't see them anymore for the rest of the episode, and so that gives us another unsatisfying conclusion to his story arc. But what pissed me off more is that we were supposed to believe that Dany made a lot of character progression, but at the end, all she ever wanted was the throne. I would have liked it more if Dany maybe would have realized that it's not about the throne, but about the well-being of the people. Almost all her big decisions were made to secure that the most vulnerable are safe. Last episode, she threw that all off the window. I said before that her transformation to the Mad Queen needed more time to flourish, because now it feels like that Dany just said, "Screw it, I just want to sit on the throne," and all the deep layer of the character is gone. Again, to make this Mad Queen storyline work, you can't rush it. We as viewers have to see her slowly getting to the point of the Mad Queen. And 2 episodes are not enough to build this up. And it's not enough to override 7 seasons and 4 episodes, just so you can play your Mad Queen card out of nowhere. A lot of time passes and Tyrion is held for trial again, but now he doesn't have the trial by combat option. The most powerful humans in Westeros are there to decide his fate, and yes people, these are the most powerful people in Westeros. What happened with the rest of Westeros? Seriously, where are all the people of Westeros? Is there only King's Landing in the north? The Night King couldn't even pass through Winterfell, and the most brutal winter everybody predicted didn't arrive, so they should still be there, right? Are these really the most powerful characters of Game of Thrones? The world feels so dead now, but for all the wrong reasons. I know it's unreasonable to think, after what we saw this season, that this was going to be a great final, but I didn't know they could double down on my biggest complaints. The dialogue is even dumber than before, Westeros is emptier and even more lifeless than before, characters' motives and decisions are more simplistic than ever, looking at you Bran, and there's no depth left in characters. Also, talking about characters being simplistic, Grey Worm tells us Jon is imprisoned because he killed Dany, which means that Jon actually told them he killed Dany. Pause. I'm just speechless. I know Jon is not the smartest man in the world, but seriously? He could have just said that Drogon flew off with Dany and he would be good. This was a last subtle hint from D&D that character decisions is worth nothing anymore. He's gonna get out safe anyway, so why even bother? It doesn't matter what his decision is, he's gonna survive this no matter what he decides. The Unsullied were ready to kill Jon earlier this episode for some minor disagreement, but now he killed their fucking queen, which they have served for so long, and they just imprison him? Okay, whatever I guess. So now that leaves us just with one thing. Who is gonna be the next ruler of the Seven Kingdoms? And Tyrion suggests Bran, and everybody kinda agrees with it, with the exception of Sansa. She wants the North to be independent, so Bran is ruler of the Six Kingdoms instead of the Seven Kingdoms. Tyrion just gets away and he's the hand of the king now, and Jon also just gets away like that, and his punishment, if we can even call that a punishment, is that he has to serve for the Night Watch. But this time, not because he's a bastard, but because he's a criminal. But only because some dudes who probably never visit Westeros anyway say so. And Jon once broke his oath of the Night Watch, and he's gonna do it again, because who on earth needs a Night Watch anyway, after the most serious threat is defeated? So ultimately, there was no real consequence for Jon's action, nor any punishment. Color me surprised. Arya sets sail. She wants to know what's on the other side of the world. Sansa gets to be the Queen of the North. Grey Worm sails to the Isle of Nav, which I think is the island of Missandei, or where she came from. I still can't believe that this guy outlived Dany, Cersei, Missandei. Just crazy. Bronn got Highgarden, and he's in the Council of Bran alongside Sam, who's a Maester now, Davos, who's also a Maester now, and Brienne, who now is the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Also, Brienne finished writing the legacy of Jaime, and I also really like this scene, because it still shows you how much Jaime means to Brienne at the end. And then Game of Thrones ends as it began, with people going beyond the wall, minus the White Walkers, which means that winter is ultimately gone and everybody lived happily ever after. Finn. Yes, people, they just made a fairy tale ending. Game of Thrones just got a fairy tale ending. This ending might as well be from the Grimm brothers or from Hans Christian Andersen, but it surely is not the vision that George R.R. Martin had in mind. I know this last bit of this review was rushed, but so are the last season and this entire season of Game of Thrones, and especially this episode. Yes, they wrapped this show up so quickly that ultimately there is nothing more for me to criticize or praise about this episode. It is what it is. I knew this season was going to be shit right after they killed the Night King, in the dumbest way I have ever seen. Not dumb for Game of Thrones standards, but dumb in general. You just don't end such a serious threat like that, just so we can get our happy little fairy tale at the end. I originally just wanted to criticize the third episode, but my plans somehow changed along the way. I honestly don't even know if it was worth criticizing Game of Thrones after Season 8 Episode 3. It was clear to me that the very moment that the Night King died, this show died with him. If that was the final nail in the coffin, then everything else after that was just D&D, burying the coffin that is Game of Thrones as fast as possible, because they have another project to bury. But this is a review of episode 6. So what's my final rating for this episode? The first 20 minutes were very strong, and it was still decent until the 40-minute mark. But once Bran was the ruler of the kingdom, a character that has done nothing this season to justify it, and Tyrion, Jon, Sansa, Arya, basically everyone of the main characters got a good fairy tale-like ending. The episode took a nosedive into the deepest sewer in the world. In the first seasons of Game of Thrones, I said to myself I would be happy if any of the main characters got a good ending. But now, everybody gets a happily ever after ending. My expectations were truly subverted. 3 out of 10. These are all my previous ratings of the episodes 1 to 3 and for the episodes 4 to 6. After some quick maths, I then have the final rating of this 8th and final season of Game of Thrones, which is 4.3 out of 10, and rounded down that would be 4 out of 10. There's probably a bunch of things I still could have criticized, but I didn't want to make this too long. It's already too long as it is. There are some things I probably didn't mention or just forgot about while doing this video that a lot of other people have probably criticized more in depth. But this video as it is already took very long to do, and I think you get the overall idea about most of the criticism from my side in season 8 and for a lot of other people too. Rushing a big story like Game of Thrones is gonna end up horribly no matter how you look at it, but at the end I'm still happy I had 4 phenomenal seasons of some of the best television I have ever watched. And everything up till season 6 was very good too, I guess. This show meant a lot to me, and seeing it end like this is heartbreaking. But it's not the first time a good show dropped the ball with the last couple of seasons, and it probably won't be the last time. Doing huge projects like Game of Thrones are time consuming for everyone on set. I mean, I'm already drained by doing this video, and this is not anywhere near what the people on set had to do. And keeping everyone on set for so many years is hard. It's understandable that D&D and the actors want to move on. Working on a project with this intensity for a decade must be very draining, and I'm glad we had an adaptation to such a beautiful story. So despite what I said, thanks D.B. Weiss and David Benioff and all the actors and crew members and Ramin Djawadi for this show, for the great entertainment we got over the years. I don't know why I'm saying this, they will never watch this anyway, but you get the point. And if you are still somehow watching, then also big thanks to you. And with that, my watch has ended.